By the time the television vans nosed along Cottonwood Drive and the homeowners association set out extra folding chairs in the shade of the pecan trees, my neighbor, Earl Whitaker, had lost the ability to control his own story. The summer evening hummed with cicadas, and the air smelled like hot asphalt and barbecued ribs from the cul-de-sac block party that I had proposed back when I still believed people preferred truth over gossip. The headline tickers on the local news teased a segment about one tenant's evidence trail, and teenagers in Dallas Cowboys jerseys filmed with their phones as Earl paced his lawn like a minister about to deliver a sermon that nobody asked for. He waved his printed papers, muttered about conspiracies and infiltration and property values, words that traveled like gnats on the heat, too small to swat without looking ridiculous. I stood on my curb under the porch light of my new rental across the street, hands steady, breath measured, and thought about how it had taken me exactly 52 days to turn humiliation into a plan, and a plan into justice, and justice into something like theater. That is the part that made people listen. You can call it strategy or pride, but I call it neighbor revenge, and I say it plain because there is no reason to pretend that pure logic ever changes a man like Earl. Spectacle does. The homeowners association president, a tired woman named Dolores with a clipboard that made her shoulders slope, tapped the microphone and asked for order. The crowd obeyed with the gleeful hush of people about to see a magic trick. I waited. I did not hurry. I wanted the timing to be perfect, wanted Earl to fill the silence with his own condemnations, to show his teeth, to tell on himself. He did not disappoint. He told the gathered neighbors that the block had been under siege, that unknowable forces wanted his fence line, wanted his view of the retention pond, wanted his peace and his property and his history. He did not say my name yet, but he did not have to. Everyone knew that last month he convinced the landlord to serve me with an eviction notice by calling the police and telling them I was a drug addict. Everyone knew that I moved out with boxes in a borrowed Ford, my hands raw from packing, my heart heavy with that old American ache that comes when a lie travels faster than the truth and wears a badge when it arrives. Everyone knew that he used language that darted and swerved, but always returned to the same pit. That place where a black man can be many things except innocent. I walked to the card table near the folding chairs and set down the manila envelope. The news crew brightened. Dolores lifted her eyebrows. I said my name out loud, said it like a doorbell, and I told them I had audio, security footage, and a notarized statement from Officer Ramirez detailing the night Earl called in his false report. I described timestamps like pewter nails, neat and in a row, camera 1, Thursday 9:17 p.m., Earl leaning over my apartment porch rail, peering into a window that reflected only his own face. Audio file, Friday 7:43 p.m. Earl telling his friend that he would handle me the way he learned to handle problems back in the plant, except he used a word that the camera did not need to capture to make its meaning plain. Notarized statement, Monday morning, 10:32 a.m. Officer Ramirez, affirming that he searched my apartment, found nothing but a French press, a stack of vinyl records, and a jar of gummy vitamins, and that the call they received contained specific false claims that place Earl as the sole source of the accusation. I told them there was more, and I told them that the rest would play on the projector that the local news had generously offered to provide, because it turns out that when a story has a villain and a surprise reversal, television will lend you electricity. The screen glowed against the dusk. Children sat on coolers. Dogs lay down with their heads between their paws. Earl said that the files were fabricated, that I had hackers, that the cloud was a tool of socialism, a phrase that made a teenage girl stifle a laugh behind her hand. The first clip rolled. The audio was not a slur, not the kind of word that the station manager would bleep, but it was enough. It was a hiss of contempt, a kind of old music played on a broken speaker, a habit of demeaning that Earl wore like a class ring. The second clip showed him on his back porch, a grainy silhouette tapping the police line with his phone, speaking with certainty about hypodermics that did not exist, and a visitor who never came, and smells that he had never smelled. The third clip, the one that landed like a gavel, was not mine. It was from his own doorbell camera because his son had posted it to the group chat of boys who skateboarded in the church parking lot, and one of them used it to make a meme about boomer paranoia. And the meme made it to Kelsey from Building B, and Kelsey sent it to me with the kind of note that says, "A person would like to be on the right side of the future." In it, Earl admitted to his cousin that he had to get that boy out of here before the market dips. He did not say black, but the weight of the missing word sagged the sentence. The crowd made the low, collective sound that people make when a performance reveals its trick, a sound like a roof settling after a storm. Dolores turned to me and asked if I would like to speak. I said that what I wanted was simple. I wanted the Homeowners Association to censure Earl publicly for harassment, to require him to attend anti-bias training that the church down on Sycamore already offered, to recommend to the landlord that my record be cleared, and that I be offered a lease on the home across the street at a fair market rate, and to publish a statement of commitment to truth over rumor. I said that I did not want a witch hunt, because I did not believe in witch hunts. I believed in evidence. I believed in process. I believed in a clean ledger and a future you can live inside without ducking your head. I said that if they did not, I had already filed a complaint with the Fair Housing Office, that I had counsel, that I had a folder of documents whose tabs matched the colors of a rainbow because order had steadied me in the worst days, and that I was prepared to use them. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The power was not in the volume, but in the arrangement, in the way each piece locked to the next, like a floor that can bear weight. Earl called me a liar. He said that the footage was deepfake technology, generated by foreign adversaries, that my calm was pharmaceutical, that my evidence trail was a carnival trick. He stepped off his grass onto the public sidewalk as if crossing into a courtroom where the law only applied to others. Then the last clip rolled. It showed Earl's own shed, a slatted shadow with a padlock, and a police body cam from 3 summers ago, the one that recorded the night officers found the small grow lights and the 8 plants at their ankles, the ones that the county did not charge because a brother-in-law knew a clerk who knew a diversion program. The officer on that tape was Officer Ramirez, younger and heavier, and he spoke in a kind and weary voice when he said that hypocrisy exhausts a city faster than heat. The crowd did not make any noise at all this time. Silence has a very specific temperature. It is cooler than shame and warmer than mercy. I did not bow. I did not gloat. I looked at Dolores and waited for governance to remember itself. She cleared her throat, asked for a vote, and the hands went up like morning glories. When the lights dimmed and the trucks packed their cables and the neighbors trickled back into their homes, I stood on the sidewalk and felt the ground under my feet the way a man does after a long car ride, grateful for the unremarkable gift of balance. Earl closed his front door. I went inside my new rental and placed the manila envelope on the kitchen table. In the refrigerator, there was leftover brisket and butcher paper and a 6-pack of Topo Chico. I poured a glass over ice and watched the fizz climb. There is a particular satisfaction in watching a lie run out of road. It is not joy, not exactly. It is relief with a backbone. It is neighbor revenge, completed without a fist, plotted with timestamps, sealed under the porch light of a street that finally saw what had been standing in front of it the entire time. Before the television vans and the folding chairs, there were quiet days that stacked like cardboard boxes in a garage, each labeled with despair in tidy marker. On the first day after the eviction notice, I drove to a weekly motel off Highway 75, where the carpet had absorbed a decade of arguments, and I set my suitcase against a dresser that pretended to be oak. The clerk slid a key across a counter and said a perfunctory welcome in a tone I recognized from every threshold where a man like me is granted entry with a half-closed eye. The air unit rattled like a very old idea. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the ceiling and felt the weight of every story I knew about people like me being pushed out by people like Earl. I thought of my father in Houston in the 90s, how a neighbor called the cops because he thought my father looked like somebody he had seen on a poster stapled to a telephone pole. The cops were polite. My father was polite. The poster was not my father. The apology was not an apology. That is how the story goes, with different names, different zip codes, same script. On the second day, I stopped drinking coffee because it made my hands shake, and I needed my hands to be steady if I wanted to hold a camera. I bought a doorbell camera on sale at a big box store where a teenage clerk offered a discount code after he recognized me from a pickup basketball game at the YMCA. He said the word bro once and then blushed because he thought it would sound patronizing. I told him that it sounded like humanity and I accepted the discount. At the motel, I set the camera on the windowsill, pointed it at the parking lot, and told myself that vigilance is not paranoia when somebody has already shown you what they are willing to do. On the third day, I drove back to the apartment to collect the last of my boxes and nodded at Officer Ramirez as if we were 2 people in a play who had already rehearsed our lines. He asked if I needed help carrying anything. I said no and thanked him, because gratitude keeps the heart from turning into vinegar. On the fourth day, I watched Earl from my car across the street as he watered his front lawn in an old baseball cap that proclaimed allegiance to a team that had not been good in a long time. He muttered as he walked, water hissing on St. Augustine grass, a man irrigating grudges. He watched my empty porch and smiled. You learn something when a man smiles at an empty porch. You learn what he uses to feel powerful. The sun hit the aluminum of his ladder and made it shine like a brass instrument. On the fifth day, I bought a spiral notebook and wrote the word plan at the top of the first page in all caps. Under it, I wrote, neighbor revenge, ethical, lawful, thorough, undeniable. I underlined each word until the paper almost tore. I made a list of tools: video, audio, timestamps, witnesses, public record requests, the Fair Housing Office hotline, the Homeowners Association bylaws printed from a website that it looked like it had been designed on a beige computer. I added patience and circled it. Patience is the heaviest tool. On the sixth day, Kelsey from Building B knocked on my motel door. She stood with her arms crossed, like a person holding her own ribs in place. She wore a baseball cap with the logo of a craft coffee shop, and she had the honest look of someone who has decided to move from cowardice to action. She said that Earl's son had posted a video to a group chat of the church parking lot skaters. She said it was ridiculous and cruel, and that she was sorry for not believing me fast enough. She forwarded the file to my phone and said she understood if I never wanted to speak to her again. I told her that guilt is a poor currency and that if she wanted to pay me, she could testify when the time came. Her eyes filled with tears that she did not let fall, and I liked her for that. Tears can be honest, but so can restraint. On the seventh day, I went to church, not for God, though God and I have an understanding, but because the fellowship hall was where the neighborhood mediation sessions were held. The church smelled like lemon cleaner and old hymns. A social worker named Maya told me that the Homeowners Association could be pressured to enforce its own rules against harassment. She slid a list of steps across the table and underlined documentation twice. I showed her my files. She said that my evidence was as clean as a hospital hallway. She said that clean evidence changes minds that sympathy never reaches. She told me to breathe and eat protein and walk every morning because the body carries the story even when you are not telling it. On the 8th through the 20th day, I became a clerk of my own salvation. I woke before sunrise and walked the loop around the retention pond. Ducks skated off the water like they were late for work. I carried a small recorder in my pocket and narrated what I saw, what I felt, what I intended. Hearing my own voice say the word intended put steel in my spine. Midday, I filed requests, printed forms, flagged pages with pastel tabs, spoke to 2 attorneys, and taught myself how to export clips from a doorbell app without losing resolution. In the evening, I parked on Cottonwood Drive and waited for Earl to step onto his back porch to deliver his nightly benediction to nobody. I recorded the cadence of a man who had convinced himself that he was a sentinel at the gate of a past that never existed. A gate like that needs only one person to keep believing in it, and he had chosen himself. On the 21st day, I considered retaliation of the cruder sort. You think these things when you are tired, and pride is a thin blanket. I imagined spray paint on his fence. I imagined blasting music at 2 a.m. I imagined leaving a bleeding pack of hamburger meat in his mailbox in August. The kind of childish cruelty that stinks. I took a shower and let the ideas run down the drain where they belonged. A plan like mine required a clean conscience so that when I looked my own mother in the eye, I could say that I had not become the thing I despised. I ate a bowl of cereal and watched a documentary about how Broadway magicians structure misdirection. I took notes. Spectacle, reveal, restoration. These words are useful in courtrooms and at church and in cul-de-sacs where people vote with their hands. On the 29th day, I met with Officer Ramirez at a diner that still had chrome napkin dispensers. He ordered coffee and a slice of pie and told me he remembered my father from the youth league, where Ramirez used to volunteer. He said he could not be my friend, not officially, but that he respected the way I had kept my head. He said if I wanted to make this stick, I needed to think like a carpenter and not a poet. Measure twice, cut once, he said. He signed his statement in blue ink because blue reads better on camera. When I left the diner, I sat in my Ford and held the paper like a relic, not because I worshipped it, but because faith, even in paper, can move stubborn mountains when a community is watching. On the 34th day, I pitched the story to the local news. They said they do not usually run neighbor disputes, but they were curious about a case where the evidence stacked like law. They asked whether I wanted to be anonymous. I said that I wanted the opposite. I wanted my name to be the thing people heard when they thought of this block. Not because I sought fame, but because erasure is the favorite tool of people like Earl, and I would deny him that tool forever. They sent a producer with sharp eyes and a soft handshake. She said timing is everything. I smiled because I had been living inside timing for a month, and it had sharpened me like a blade. On the 42nd day, I approached Dolores with kindness because the office of a homeowners association president is a lonely kitchenette where neighbors bring complaints like casseroles nobody wants to eat. I showed her my tabs. I showed her the bylaws she had forgotten were there. I did not threaten. I simply set the table for the meal the street needed to eat. She said she would schedule a special meeting. I thanked her and placed a lemon pound cake on her counter because hospitality teaches a truth that argument forgets. A person who has eaten at your table must work harder to dismiss you. It is not fair. It is human. On the 52nd day, the vans arrived. I had ironed my shirt. My shoes were clean. The heat was a fact and not a punishment. The neighbors walked toward the folding chairs in the gracious twilight, and I thought about how a plan that had been born in a motel with a rattling air conditioner and a man alone now belonged to a block of people who would be forced to choose which story to live inside. Earl performed himself. I performed the evidence. The neighborhood chose. The fuse I had built out of patience and paper burned clean, and when the spark reached the powder of truth, it did not explode so much as it illuminated. That is enough. Illumination is a kind of justice that leaves nobody deaf. The week after the vote, the street turned into a carnival of absurdities because men like Earl do not retire from their mythologies. They add feathers. He posted a hand-lettered sign in his yard that said no filming, and then walked the perimeter holding his phone at arm's length like a badge. He wore sunglasses that were famous in 1989 and a bucket hat that suggested both sun protection and apocalyptic dread. He announced to anyone within radius that the homeowners association had been infiltrated by professional actors, that Officer Ramirez was a crisis performer imported from a studio backlot in Burbank, that the ducks at the retention pond were drone decoys deployed to spy in his yard. Children gently mocked him by quacking in monotone whenever he walked past, which made their parents blush with the complicated shame of wanting to be kind, while also wanting to live in the kind of neighborhood where satire is unnecessary. I watered my small box of basil on my porch and waved when he looked. I waved like a man blessed by the simplest gifts. His conspiracy escalated with the weather. One afternoon, he clambered up that shining aluminum ladder and tried to staple laminated copies of the Constitution to his shingles. The ladder slipped, and he slid into a bed of rosemary with a grunt that stirred memories of a time when he could have been a different person. I helped him up because neighbor revenge does not require a hospital bill. He swatted my hand and told me I would not fool him. That is when the Weed Council arrived. You would call them code enforcement officers, but in this chapter of the story, we will call them the Weed Council because the satire fits. They ticketed his untamed crabgrass because a man who burns his credibility inevitably lets his edges go. He called them tyrants. They told him to buy a mower. He said he had a mower and that it was solar-powered, and he gestured at a broken Roomba he had spray-painted green. The Weed Council took a picture, promised to return, and left with a smile they had not earned but accepted anyway. My doorbell camera noticed a new cast of characters. There was a man with a YouTube channel that reviews flashlights who arrived to interview Earl about the siege. There was a woman who sold crystals from the trunk of a Buick that had a bumper sticker announcing that Mercury is always in retrograde. There was a cheerful fellow who claimed to build Faraday cages out of reclaimed chicken wire. Earl held court with them and gestured toward my porch as if my basil were a satellite dish and my wind chimes were a threat to national sovereignty. I did not object because I had learned the lesson that saved me. Do not interrupt an enemy while he demolishes his own house. The Homeowners Association sent a formal letter reminding Earl that gatherings required permits. He posted the letter on his door like a diploma and declared victory. Meanwhile, the internet did what the internet does when a storyline can be captured in 3 beats and a thumbnail: villain, receipts, reversal. The teenage girl who laughed behind her hand at the meeting made an edit of the projector night with a triumphant soundtrack and a freeze frame of Dolores's raised hands. The video acquired captions, then commentary, then parodies, then a brief cameo on a late-night show where where the host read a line from Earl's Shed Saga and let his eyebrows do the rest. Strangers sent me recipes, prayers, and book recommendations about reconciliation. A high school buddy texted to say that he always knew I would be the guy with color-coded tabs who would defeat a neighborhood bigot without breaking a sweat. I told him it was not sweat I had avoided, it was bitterness. Sweat had been the whole project. Because satire is a hall of mirrors, I added my own flourish. I started a podcast with exactly 3 episodes called Cottonwood Quorum, in which I narrated the strange, funny, and ultimately human events of our block. I described Earl with dignity and distance, never naming him, only calling him a man who chose the wrong tools to feel safe. I described Dolores as the reluctant centerer that every community builds by accident. I described Officer Ramirez as the kind of civil servant a city quietly depends on. The podcast was not popular, which made me happy because not every story needs to be a market. It traveled just far enough to land in the email inbox of the Fair Housing Office investigator who was handling my case. She thanked me for being thorough and for telling the story with care. She asked whether I would be willing to speak to a training session of new investigators. I said yes. She said that they would love to hear how neighbor revenge could be ethical, lawful, thorough, and undeniable. I told her that all good revenge is simply the restoration of balance with the lights on. Earl tried one more theater piece. He arranged pointy lawn ornaments in a circle and stood inside them wearing a cape that his wife had sewn from blackout curtains. He announced a citizen tribunal and invited the block to attend at dawn. Only the flashlight reviewer came, and he brought a thermos of coffee and a new headlamp. Earl declared me a public nuisance and sentenced me to 100 hours of community service scrubbing graffiti that I had never written. The flashlight reviewer applauded because a silence would have been impolite. The sun rose with the same indifference it has shown to smaller and greater absurdities. The weed council returned and wrote a second ticket. In these carnival weeks, I learned that parody does not erase pain. It gilds it, which makes the shape easier to see. Racism had always been the motor in Earl's machine, but the chrome he added in the form of conspiracies made the engine visible. When he spoke now, even the people who had once nodded along could hear the empty. They made excuses for him out of habit, then caught themselves in the act, as if their mouths had walked a familiar path and suddenly discovered that the bridge was gone. The block became kinder by increments. One trash can returned to a driveway, one wave from a porch, one casserole delivered to the older black couple on the corner, who had been living with a kind of carefulness that no person should have to audition for, not even once, not even a little. One evening, as the cicadas warmed up, Earl's wife, Naomi, walked over with a plastic container of lemon bars. She held them out like a plea. She said she was sorry for everything. She said that Earl was not always like this, that fear had poured into him like quickset concrete, that standing too long in a certain kind of media had stiffened him into a statue of himself. I took the lemon bars and thanked her. She cried, and the tears were not theatrical. I told her that I did not hate her husband. I told her that I hated what he had chosen, and what those choices had tried to do to me. She nodded. She said that she was looking at apartments near her sister. I told her that peace is not a metaphor. It is a place with a lease, and I wished her luck in finding it. By the end of the month, a for sale sign sprouted from Earl's lawn. It leaned slightly, as if the earth under his grass remembered all the stomping. Real estate agents came and went with smiles that revealed their talent for pretending not to smell smoke. I watered my basil, I waved to the ducks. I made a playlist called Restoration, and I let it play softly while I cooked dinner in my small, sunlit kitchen. It felt like balance, not triumph. Balance is quieter. It hums like a refrigerator and tastes like cool water. Here is the part of the story where I borrow a trick from the old Southern storytellers and lace the ending with a brush of the fantastic. Not to lie, but to lay truth in a brighter frame. After the for sale sign came the open house, and after the open house came the moving truck. And after the moving truck came a dawn that felt like an unclenching. Earl stood on his driveway with a cardboard box labeled Garage Important, which likely contained nothing more crucial than the kind of objects a man believes will keep him safe from time. He looked across at me. I looked back. He raised his hand as if to wave, then stopped, because apology requires a willingness to lose, and he did not know how to do that. He climbed into the passenger seat of a tan sedan that had lost its hubcaps to curbs in years. Naomi drove. The sedan rolled down Cottonwood Drive, past the pecan trees that had grown there longer than any of us, and past the retention pond where the drone ducks resumed being birds. When the sedan turned out onto Sycamore, A parade of improbable witnesses lined the street. The weed council saluted with their ticket pads. The flashlight reviewer stood in the shade, offering a respectful nod. Officer Ramirez, off duty and in a worn ball cap, leaned against his truck and tipped the brim. Dolores held her clipboard like a hymnal and whispered to herself the names of the bylaws she had reacquainted herself with, as if reciting them might keep the neighborhood inside the guardrails of sense. Kelsey from Building B pressed her lips together and did not cry because she had promised herself she would not. The teenage girl filmed it all because capturing departures is her generation's way of trusting that they really happened. The ducks glided without comment. The basil on my porch released a green sweetness into the morning. If you had been there, you would have felt a softness that was not pity and not triumph. It was the way a room feels when somebody finally tells the truth and the furniture returns to its natural places. Now for the tall tale. 3 days after the sedan disappeared, some of the boys said they saw a beam of light on the far side of the retention pond and a figure in a bucket hat stepping onto a gleaming ship that hummed like cicadas and smelled like rosemary. They swore the ship lifted without stirring a leaf. They swore it dissolved into the sky like a just apology. Others say he moved to Oklahoma. I am willing to entertain both versions because the point is not where he went. The point is what stayed. What stayed was a homeowners association that remembered it had a spine. What stayed was a street where a casserole moved quickly when a baby was born to the couple at the corner, who had finally allowed themselves to speak loudly on their own porch. What stayed was a block party where a jazz trio set up by the pecan trees, and I grilled ribs while a boy from Building D asked me how to organize receipts and timestamps for a school project about local history. I told him that the secret to neighbor revenge is that it should never end with ruin. It should end with a ledger wiped clean and a door left open, because a closed door traps you with your anger, while an open one gives the breeze a place to enter. In the quiet after the music, I walked the loop around the pond. The air had that Dallas evening weight, but it felt like a blanket and not a sentence. I thought about the motel, the rattling unit, the spiral notebook that still sits on my shelf with the word plan carved into the first page. I thought about my father, about the way he once told me that the hardest part of being a black man in America is not that you have to be twice as good. It is that you have to keep your joy from being stolen while you do it. I thought about Naomi and her lemon bars and the long, private journey of a person who wants to become new inside a life that keeps delivering them old versions of themselves. I thought about the word restore, which is the most American of verbs because it admits that we have broken things and insists that we can repair them. A month later, I spoke to the new investigators at the Fair Housing Office. I stood in a conference room with windows that looked out over a parking lot filled with the quiet gleam of government sedans. And I told them the particulars. I told them about timestamps and tabs, about patience and walking before dawn, about not letting your plan be derailed by the daily insult. I told them that the phrase neighbor revenge should never mean blood or vandalism or late-night shouting. It should mean the elegant inevitability of evidence. It should mean a community deciding to live by the story that makes the most sense when told under the porch light. They took notes. Some of them smiled the way people do when they recognize the tool they will need later, on a day when courage is in short supply. After the session, I drove back to Cottonwood Drive and sat on my porch with a glass of ice water. Across the street, there was a new family in Earl's old house. They had a toddler who loved trucks and a grandmother who grew collard greens in a tidy garden plot. In the evenings, the grandmother and I traded recipes over the low fence that a reasonable person could see through. She told me that the secret to greens is a slow simmer and the right kind of vinegar. I told her that the secret to brisket is patience and smoke and knowing when to stop fussing. We laughed. The ducks drifted. The basil thrived. Later that night, I opened the spiral notebook and turned past the page where plan lived, past the pages where I had listed steps in tight handwriting. I wrote a new word at the top of a clean page, peace. Under it I wrote, not the absence of conflict, but the presence of fairness. Then, almost as an afterthought, I wrote, neighbor revenge complete, not as a boast, but as a benediction for a story that had asked a great deal of me and had given something back. I closed the notebook and set it beside the manila envelope, which I kept, not because I needed it anymore, but because it is good to remember that a clean ledger is something you can hold. If you ask me how it felt at the end, I will tell you that it felt like this. The porch light threw a circle on the steps, the street was quiet except for a single television somewhere playing a baseball game, and the air smelled like cut grass and the faintest trace of rosemary on a neighbor's fingertips. I sat there until the circle of light slid across the rail and rested on my shoes. Then I went inside and slept with the windows open.